the focus of your book, you wanted to focus more on people on the ground and like the left from I guess the ground up. What were some of the disconnects that you might have observed between, say, politicians like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and maybe what their focus was uh,
Sorry,
from a rhetoric? Sorry, from did we lose her? Oh, okay. From a rhetorical perspective, versus what some organizers were focused on.
So I think, I mean, the best example of that probably was Jonathan Smucker, who's been doing a lot of organizing in Lancaster County in Pennsylvania, which is where he's from. And he is somebody who taught me a lot about organizing in that context, where it's not, I think that people who are doing this work, particularly in certain communities that are more conservative, it's very disconnected from the Twitter discourse, right? They're not out there chanting slogans. They're not saying things like defund the police. In many ways, they're shying away from labeling themselves as socialists, even when they are socialists, right? So virtually everybody I talked to for the book actually is a socialist, or had said at some point to me, I am a socialist, but I don't necessarily lead with that in my organizing. And that includes even some socialists in New York City who were trying to organize in communities like the Bronx and certain parts of Brooklyn, where they just felt like the word was not serving them and was not something that they could really meaningfully connect to the policies that they were promoting. So I think that, you know, that's one thing that really gets lost in the reporting on our politics right now, is that so much of it is just about things that happen on Twitter, and people are not really paying as much attention to what's happening in different communities on the ground. I'm from Buffalo, New York. I end the book talking about India Walton, who actually won the Democratic primary for mayor in 2021, which was a truly stunning moment to me as somebody who, you know, was born and raised in Buffalo, which is a very different environment than New York City, much more conservative. And then she was crushed by the Democratic establishment in the general election because they colluded with Republicans to prevent her from winning. But that's something that only happened because people were doing work on the ground. That's not something that happened because everybody who votes in Buffalo is on Twitter and got really into AOC or something like that. It was like, you know, very much had to do with investment. Working Families Party invested in talking to people in communities in Buffalo that had been completely overlooked for years.
I want to ask you like what constitutes the broad left, but I want to just stop for a moment too on that what you found with the organizers finding that the word socialist wasn't working for them, and that it was not like the idea, because Bernie Sanders started off his campaign in 2020 differently than he did in 2016. I mean, obviously he was I think more prepared to win in some ways, at least I think from his perspective in 2020 than he was in 2016 in terms of what his agenda was for running. But he started off his campaign by trying to explain or present the idea of democratic socialism and socialism to some extent in his like almost his opening speech of his campaign, maybe the second one, and that dynamic where the socialists that you spoke to felt like it wasn't necessary to sell socialism as an ideology, but rather as a set of issues or, you know, specific to the place and the time. Talk about that a little bit more. I'm curious about that dynamic.
Sure. I mean, I think that there's two things I would say about that. One is that sometimes there's a difference between making a sort of tactical or strategic choice in a particular race to not sort of front and center socialism as such, or to avoid the word or something like that. To me, that doesn't mean that you're less committed to the ideology. For some people, they're not at all committed to the ideology and they don't care about the word, and they don't feel, you know, Jessica Cisneros, who ran in South Texas, she's a Justice Democrat-backed candidate. And I was talking to someone about her campaign, and he said she really didn't want to use that word because she's not a socialist. It doesn't mean anything to her. She didn't think it would mean anything to most people in her community. In New York City, I think the issue was more around people have certain associations with the word, and people were DSA candidates in New York City were sort of trying to do two things at once. They were trying to win particular races in particular communities and also make a connection for people between socialism as an ideology and a practice, frankly, more than an identity, and the issues and the improvements in quality of life that it could yield. And I think that goes back to, a much earlier era in our country in the 10s, 20s, and 30s, when there were socialists in office all over the country. And the phrase sewer socialism sort of came out of that. And that's the idea that you can connect municipal services and improvements in quality of life in a city to socialism, right? To public ownership of public goods, and getting people, making that link in people's minds between what does it mean when I say I'm a socialist and what can that do for you? What can that do for us? So, people approach it really differently, and it depends on the individual and the particular election. But I think people were doing that in different ways in different parts of the country.
So what does constitute, as you write about the new left, like what is the left part of that new left? Like what constitutes that the left?
The way that I use it in my book, and I think there's a paragraph where I just sort of tried to make it very explicit, but it's just what I mean by that is people who are to the left of the Democratic Party and support policies that are not part of the official platform of the Democratic Party. So Medicare for all, the Green New Deal, immigrants' rights, abortion rights, but abortion rights in a sort of framework that is distinct from the way the Democratic Party supports abortion rights, which is mostly to say the word abortion or say reproductive freedom and then not really protect it in any meaningful way. I mean, we lost Roe, so clearly they failed to protect it. I think that, it's not what everybody, and I think one thing I also talk about in the book is that the left is a kind of an amorphous, broad term that means different things to different people. I was sort of amused when I've been talking about this book and going around the country, how many people think that I mean just Democrats, that I mean actually Democratic voters or members of the Democratic Party, and that is the left. And that's sort of part of the problem and part of what I'm trying to get at in the book, that in fact there's a movement that's pretty separate and distinct from that.
Go ahead.
Well, how does it manifest its distinction? I mean, within our politics, how is that distinction manifested? I mean, yes, the Democratic Party failed to codify Roe v. Wade. I suspect that was a function of like overconfidence that it would not be overturned, and a sense of like, why step into a political fight that is ultimately going to be, for an insurance policy. I mean, now we know why you do that. And they did that with, they're in the process of doing that with marriage equality and with, the right to marry within races because, well, who knows with the Supreme Court. But how does that left distinct from the Democratic Party work and maybe, manifests itself? And how much of that is it just a function of, from your perspective, how does it manifest itself?
I think it means, again, I mean, it really does just mean different things to different people. And I think that it's not as if you can't be part of the left if you vote Democratic. I talked to many, many people who still vote for Democrats, but they're very critical of the party as an institution. I think that, part of the issue is that the word progressive has become really a kind of mushy umbrella term, and that's on purpose in a lot of ways, because people who are not really part of the left want to position themselves. Andrew Cuomo used to describe himself many, many times, described himself in public as a as a true progressive or a real progressive or the actual champion of progressive politics. And so
he also, to be fair, he also described himself, I think, as a Muslim woman, as a gay man, as a,
right.
I mean, he had a long list of things that he would describe himself as.
That's very true.
And never as a criminal, which was odd. But be that as it may, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
He certainly never described himself as a socialist. That's one
Right.
distinction he didn't make. And there's a difference. There's a difference within the left, right, between people who will say, I'm a progressive Democrat, and people who are comfortable saying, I'm a democratic socialist. So there are different parts of the left. I just really mean it to be anyone who, again, is to the left of the official sort of mainstream Democratic Party and its positions, policy positions.
How much of, like, where does the perspective on electoralism fit in that, right? I mean, because like AOC is, I mean, she's a Democratic congressperson,
right.
You know, and I think her positions are to the left of where the center of the Democratic Party is, but in terms of like manifesting, you know, the way that she operates, where does she fall in that category of the left? Does participation in electoralism, or at least, you know, I mean, in a fairly concerted way, right? I mean, she runs for office. She's encouraging people to vote and be involved in that system. I think she also encourages things like mutual aid and organizing in a way that we haven't seen from Democratic politicians, like you say, in generations. But I'm just curious where that line comes down. Some people draw it pretty definitively. And we also have to say, I guess, like as like an asterisk, is we're talking about American politics, and
right.
Our left is not our left. You know, our left is generally not as left as, you know, European left or Latin American left or
That's
African
right.
left, for that matter.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I consider AOC part of the left. You could certainly find people who would disagree with me on that and say that her willingness to toe the line in certain ways, her votes on certain bills, her relationship with Nancy Pelosi makes her not part of the left. I'm not really, I try not to get involved in sort of policing those boundaries. I think it's more about what you do than what you say you are, right? So if you are fighting on the same side as me on X, Y, or Z policy issue, and it seems that you're doing work that is actually advancing the cause of justice in this area or that area, then I consider you a comrade. Not everybody would make that same, not everybody agrees with that. And I don't think, you know, but it's sort of like, it's like being a feminist or being a socialist. Those are both terms that mean a lot of things to a lot of people. And I'm not somebody who would ever say, well, I'm kicking you out of the feminist tent or what. I don't have that authority. And to me, I subscribe to the bell hooks view of feminism, which is that it's a practice. It's a thing anybody can do and opt into. It's the struggle against sexist oppression. That's an action. It's not a static identity. And I would say that is also true about the left. In terms of electoralism, I mean, that's a debate that's live even within a smaller subset of the left, even within socialist organizations. There's a lot of controversy around, you know, how useful is it to participate in electoral politics? When does it become counterproductive? Is it a dead end? And all of those conversations, and those are ongoing, and they have been for years.